bit of review. Let's start with a little bit of review. We talked about three main Jewish denominations in a previous chapter. Do you guys remember what those were offhand?
Reform.
Yeah, so we had, we'll put them left to right for a reason. Reform, what else? Orthodox. And what else?
Hasidic.
We're going to talk about them today. They're going to fit in the Orthodox spectrum. You guys remember the one that was, it's kind of it'll throw you because normally we expect that term to mean that they're over on this side, but they're actually in the middle position between Reform and Orthodox. Anyone remember what the third one? Yeah.
The conservative.
Very good. And historically, the Reform are the ones to have the first sort of, hardcore identity as such, because they're taking the ideas of the Enlightenment and they're applying them to the Jewish religion. And then the Orthodox are the ones who just keep on doing the same thing as before. And the Reform are the ones calling them Orthodox originally. And then the Conservative is about sort of a mediating influence between the two. Now, those are the big Jewish denominations. There's two others that we left out. One calls itself a denomination, the other one really doesn't call itself a denomination. So one of the ones that we left out would be the Reconstructionist. And in many ways, the reason why I put them on a spectrum like this, in many ways, the Reconstructionists are even further, they're more radical than the Reform Jews. Although they come out of the conservative movement, they're sort of swinging way over. Orthodox Judaism is a little bit more complex than we would think. And the Hasidic kind of fit over here. Also, the ones that would fit over here would be, and this is sort of a catch-all term, the Haredi, which means those who fear God, Orthodox. These are the ones that are sometimes called ultra-Orthodox. They're very strict about things. And then we have the modern Orthodox. There's other terms that get thrown in here too, like yeshivish Jews. Not everything is as neat and cut and dry as I'm presenting it here. But this kind of gives you the big idea. And we're mostly interested today in thinking about these, where did these guys come from and what's distinctive about them. And then we'll talk about what's going on demographically with Judaism in America. And we'll talk about culture, how Judaism has had a lot of effect on American culture. So, your book starts out talking about Reconstructionism. And like I said, it was an outgrowth of the conservative movement. This guy, Mordecai Kaplan, was a professor at Jewish Theological Seminary. And he writes this book, Judaism as a Civilization. And some of the key ideas in that text are that God is not personal. It doesn't mean that God doesn't take things personally, or that, God, you can't really bother God or something like that. It means God is not personal. That's a radical departure from the traditional conception of God, though, isn't it? What's the traditional concept of God? And don't just say personal, because we already said that. What does it mean for God to be personal? What does that mean for religious believers? Yeah?
That means that they're able to connect with Him in a certain way.
Yeah.
He's a personal person.
Exactly. So God is a person, and just like I'm talking with you, we're now engaged in a dialogue, and I'm not actually talking, I'm talking, of course, because I'm teaching, I'm talking to other students, but you and I are like having a one-on-one right now, at least for a moment. That's a personal connection, right? After class, somebody sticks around, we shoot the breeze about something. That's a personal connection. What are you doing when you pray? You're interacting with something that's supposed to actually care about you as a person. Otherwise, why do it? There's a lot of things that would go along with changing the conception of God, right? Now, there are reasons to pray besides that, but that's something to think about. The Jews are not a chosen people. That's a big one too, isn't it? Because traditional Jewish ideas, the Jews are a chosen people, for better or for worse. As a matter of fact, a lot of times they're not happy to be a chosen people because it means that everybody else gets to screw around and do whatever they want, but, they're supposed to follow the kosher laws. Or they've got this, this God who gets angry with them if they don't do the right things. And sometimes being chosen isn't always best. Some of you may be able to relate to that on an individual level. If you were the smart kid who had to get the good grades, or the artistic kid, or whatever your family put on you, sometimes being chosen isn't always great, is it? How should we understand Judaism then? He says, Judaism is best understood as a complex of culture and tradition. So, Judaism is a complex of culture and tradition. And you might say, well, what good are the traditions? Well, they're supposed to reveal things to us. Think about, for example, Passover. We've talked about this before. What happens at the Passover meal? People just get together and put their feet on the table and say, hey, haven't seen you for a year, how you been? That might be Thanksgiving. Although I don't know anyone who puts their feet on the table at Thanksgiving, but you get the idea. What happens at Passover?
Right.
People pray, and do they just make up whatever prayers they want? Oh God, let this be the year that we finally hit the jackpot. That would be inappropriate there, wouldn't it? What are they praying about? What are they remembering? What passed over? Yeah, that's pretty serious stuff, isn't it? The angel of death that killed all the firstborn during the Exodus passed over the Hebrews and didn't kill all the firstborn because they had sprinkled the blood of the lamb. That's part of why they have the lamb at Passover. There's a lot of things involved in this. A lot of Christian Easter rituals are derived from the Passover. As a matter of fact, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, it's just called Pas, which means Passover, originally. The Last Supper was a Passover meal. All of that would just be a bunch of cultural traditions that a person could still find meaningful, but wouldn't have any literal value. A Reconstructionist Jew would say, well, there's no such thing as angels of death, but we can still get some meaning out of this. It can still matter to us. And eventually they become a whole movement. They're able to open up the Reconstructional Rabbinical College. Like it says, the tradition was beginning to modify its early de-emphasis on the supernatural by including references to biblical miracles in the Messianic age in its recently revised prayer book. But most Reconstructionist Jews understand these as symbolic or mythical. They're just allegories. They're supposed to tell us something. You can tell that they're pretty far on the liberal spectrum because they also talk about the matriarchs as well as the patriarchs. You got to do a bit of digging for that, but there's plenty of female characters in the Bible that kind of stand out with that sort of thing, like Esther and Ruth and people like that. There's even a female judge, blanking on her name right now, but she led Israel in fighting. Now we swing all the way to the other side, Hasidic Jews. So the Hasidic movement begins in the 18th century. And so they're kind of, an offshoot from the Orthodox, before the Orthodox called themselves Orthodox. And it's mostly happening in Eastern Europe. And the Hasidic Jews are reacting against what they feel is the sort of top-down, rabbi-in-charge, sterile religious experience that they're having. What they want to have instead is a more direct connection with God through daily life. Something that doesn't require you to study Talmud, to go off to some sort of yeshiva or rabbinical school and spend years and years doing that. Something that the ordinary person could relate to. It doesn't mean that they don't have religious figures. They do in fact have rebbes, rabbis, teachers. And then there's the role of somebody who is called a tzaddik. It's translated as saint. And this would be a holy person who is so in touch with God that their very contact or presence is sort of, emanating godliness. It goes so far with some where they'll actually save the crumbs from a meal that this person has, because somehow what we might call the aura of sanctity connects with them. But they were really interested in, like it says, a very down-to-earth, extremely traditional Jewish piety. Also ecstatic singing, dance, movement. Your book talks about this as a total immersion style of Orthodox Judaism, in which all other considerations are subordinated to the imperative of leading as pure a religious life as possible. So one key thing is the sanctification of everyday life. Everything that a person can do, that a person does, can be an act of worship. Hasidic neighborhoods possess all the material needs for strict observance. So synagogues, you need a place to go. Religious schools, Hebrew bookstores, kosher restaurants and butcher shops, and a bathhouse. Now, why would you need a bathhouse? Well, because the traditional, Jewish law says that there are certain times when a woman actually has to bathe, ritually. And these were things that you could find in ancient Israel, because that was part of the law. And you can find these in Hasidic neighborhoods as well. Your book talks about some of the divisions between them, but it doesn't tell you much about them, so I'm actually going to sort of skip over that. One of the things I do want to talk about that your book doesn't dwell on very much, since we are in this area, is you've all seen, I think, whether you've been to neighborhoods or not, Hasidic Jewish families in transit. You go anywhere along the interstates and stop at rest areas. You see them, right? How can you tell that they're Hasidic Jews? As opposed to, say, Reformed Jews or conservative Jews. What's distinctive? Yeah.
Their way of dress and like their hairstyles that they have.
Yeah. Now, the way of dress is actually, there's nothing, necessary, it's not, biblical or something like that, for the most part. I mean, covering the head and that sort of stuff is. But it's derived from 17th and 18th century Eastern Europe. They adopted a particular way of dress, and that is continued through. And you can make it with nicer material or, cheaper material, depending on your tastes. You can innovate to some degree. But for the most part, it's, it's almost always a white shirt, right? And black, dark pants, black jacket, hat, and then the forelocks that's again part of traditional Jewish piety. Hasidic Jews aren't the only ones to do that. Some of the Orthodox who are not Hasidic also do that. But they're the ones that you're going to see more and more of. This is where we get to talking about demographics. What is demography? Demography is a study of people and numbers. So if we're talking about growth in one community and decline in another community, that's demography. Talking about your generation of college students as being twice the size of my generation, that's demography as well. Generation X, which is what I belong to, is half the size of the other two generations, the boomers and you guys. Where is growth taking place in the Jewish community? Right now, Reformed Jews are the largest group of religious Jews. There are a lot of Jews who are not religious at all, just ethnically Jewish. Reformed Jews are the largest. Conservative and Orthodox, depending on how you parse the numbers. Conservative, there might be a little bit more of them at this time than Orthodox. Where do you think growth is taking place? It's very similar to what we saw with Protestant, mainline Protestants and conservative Protestants. Where is growth taking place? Among the Reform and the Reconstructionists? Not really. If you have traditional gender roles and you stress fertility, Hasidic families tend to have, on average, anywhere from 2 to 6, sometimes more kids. That's a very large growth rate. Hasidic Jewish populations double, and I forget exactly how often, but it's pretty soon. It's a pretty small, I think it's every generation. So they're growing. The Orthodox Jewish population is growing as well. There was a really interesting study that was released a while back called "Will Our Children Be Jewish?" And the question was, what is Judaism going to look like 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, over your lifetime? Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist Jews are not reproducing at rates necessary to maintain the community. In addition, there's one other thing that's really important to keep in mind, and we talked about this in terms of the Eastern Orthodox. Intermarriage. When you intermarry, there's always questions about, if you marry somebody from a different religion, there's a question, what are we going to do with the kids? Are we going to send them, if you're Orthodox, are we going to send them to Hebrew school? Are they going to learn the traditions? Are they going to practice those? Or are we going to sort of like say, well, wait until you're 18, then you can decide for yourself, which is basically saying to the kids, you're not going to practice anything, because most kids at 18 years old are not out there, trying out all the different religious alternatives. They're trying out all the other alternatives, right? Reform Jews, conservative Jews intermarry at pretty significant rates. And a lot of their kids are probably not going to be brought up Jewish. So these populations are shrinking pretty quickly. About 6.5 million Jews in the United States right now. As time goes on, we're going to see this part of it become predominant, and this part not completely disappear, but become, much smaller. Sort of like we've seen a lot of the mainline Protestant denominations lose a lot of their membership and grow a lot older over the last, 30, 40 years. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Your book talks about the other denominations and their sort of fortunes, but I want to skip past that. Your book then also talks about institutional forms for Jewish life, and these are institutions that you've probably come into contact with to some degree or another, because they're important, like the United Jewish Communities, which is a fundraising, essentially humanitarian charitable organization. B'nai B'rith, the Anti-Defamation League, the Hillel Foundation, the American Jewish Committee, American Jewish Congress. These are all ways in which, as organizations, Jewish people can have a role in American public life. When we get to chapter 27, we're talking about culture and economics, and to a lesser degree, politics. And that chapter begins by saying to be Jewish in 21st century America involves making choices, more so perhaps than for any other religious group. Now, why would they say that? Why? Let's say you are Jewish. Why does being Jewish entail making choices? Well, first you got to figure out, where should I be? These are not compatible. You can't be Orthodox and Reform at the same time, can you? You might actually have to decide, am I going to be religious at all? That could be a first choice that you have to make. If you are going to be religious, how are you going to understand your religiosity? Are you going to follow all 613 of the mitzvah? Not all of them actually would apply to you, For instance, the ones for you, you guys, you wouldn't have to worry about bathing after menstruation, right? Because presumably, it's not an issue. None of you hopefully will get leprosy, so that's probably not going to be a mitzvah that you would have to worry about. But the rest of them can be pretty onerous. There's a lot you have to do. It's tough to live this kind of lifestyle. Or do you see the Torah as something that is primarily an ethical code? Ceremonial stuff is to be abandoned. Is there still prejudice against Jews in some quarters here in America? Can you still find some people talking about the protocols of the elders of Zion and the Jewish conspiracy or things like that? Just type it in on Google, and you get a lot of sites. There are a lot of people still believing that sort of stuff. By the way, the protocols for the elders of Zion was actually a forged document plagiarized from an imaginary dialogue between two French philosophers. Oh no, one Italian philosopher and another French philosopher, originally written in French. That's sort of the backstory of it. Why was there a prejudice against Jews? What forms did it take? We've talked about this a little bit before. Is it just because they're other? They're different? We don't, as human beings, we don't like different people, so if Christianity is the predominant religion, or Protestant Christianity, or evangelical Protestant Christianity is the predominant religion, they're just not going to let anyone else in. These are things that are worth thinking about. What we do know is that there's two things going on at the same time. On the one hand, Jews coming to America did in fact, for the most part, do quite well, and they did quite well in part because of where they ended up, New York City, for example. We'll talk about why in a moment. But also because of certain cultural emphases. On the other hand, they also ran into prejudice. They ran into quota systems, they ran into closed doors, and this led to an interesting kind of situation. But first, let's talk about why they did well. Like your book tells you, entry into academic and professional life in New York City was facilitated by something. What would that be? Those of you who are from the city, what do you know about New York City and I don't want to say the State College because then you think of SUNY. Think about CUNY. Why was it so attractive for recent immigrants?
Money.
How so?
It's cheaper.
Yeah, I mean it actually does cost money to go there now, right?
Well, yeah, but it's...
Used to be free. If you were a resident, you could go to college for free. Just imagine that. Think about how much somebody's paying, not you necessarily, although you may be taking out loans. It could be your parents, could be the government, could be somebody. Think about how much they're paying for you to go here. And the doors this is opening up for you. Now think about the fact that you could, if you lived in New York City, if you were an immigrant and became a resident, you could go to college for free. All you had to do was demonstrate aptitude. You had to be able to, demonstrate that you were college material. And many people were college material. So like your book points out, Jews were perceived by many Gentiles as the perennial outsiders, simultaneously strange and familiar. Like a lot of other peoples from Eastern Mediterranean origin, they were adapted by temperament and experience for success in a commercially oriented culture, where education, enterprise, and adaptability all conduce towards material reward. So we've got two things going on here. We've got a religious and ethnic group that is really on the go. We have a lot of barriers occurring, saying we're not going to let you in, you can't go here, you can't work in this field. So what happens as a result? What would you do if you're in a situation like that? Let me actually put this on the board. We have education, drive, that would normally that would normally lead to success, and at the same time barriers and exclusions. You guys have probably experienced things like this. There were things that you wanted to do in your life, and somebody said, no, you can't do it. You can't be a part of our club. You can't be in our thing. We've already taken up the space. You don't get to do that. So what do you do in a situation like that? You really actually do have the passion to succeed. You just, oh, okay, I'm done. I'll go away. Is that what you do? I hope not, because this is not an economy for that sort of thing. What do? You get mad and throw rocks. Screw you! Key up people's cars. That's not going to be a particularly successful response either. What would you do? Or if you have faced that sort of situation, what do you do? Like if they barred you from swimming. We don't like girls with brown hair anymore. You know, they don't get to swim. Would you just take it?
No.
What would you do? Here you'd probably go to some administrator and say, hey, this is unfair. And let's say the administrator said, well, life is unfair. Get used to it. This is part of your education.
I would transfer.
Okay, you would transfer. You would find an alternative place to go, right? So one response to this sort of tension, is to create alternate opportunities. Would you consider doing another sport? Maybe a sport where they didn't have crazy rules like that. What if it could be kind of like swimming?
Maybe. I'm not very athletic outside of the pool.
Swimmers are extremely athletic everywhere because you guys train almost the hardest of all the things. I think you probably could adapt to other things.
Maybe.
You can also, get in on new fields where there are no limits. So how did this occur? Well, in cases where, legal firms or clothes manufacturers, Jews opened up their own businesses, their own firms. They created an entire alternative economic marketplace, and they did very well. They did that with educational institutions as well. There were also new fields in terms of American culture that were coming on the scene where they could get in, like your book says, on the proverbial ground floor, and nobody had set down any limits and said, no, you can't be involved here. What were those sorts of things? Your book talks about the motion picture industry, for example. Why did so many Jews go to Hollywood? Because it was a place where they could go, and they were on the same level playing field as everybody else. Or organizational capacity, drive, talent, those sorts of things could actually be rewarded. This, by the way, is not something unique to Jewish people. This is something that other ethnicities have done as well. But they were in sort of the right place at the right time for quite a few of these things. Your book kind of jumps around in this chapter and talks about a number of different key issues of Jewish identity. The next thing it talks about is Yiddish, and we've talked about this before. Yiddish was a dialect of German, sort of like Ladino is a dialect of the Spanish or Portuguese at the time that was spoken by the Sephardic Jews. Yiddish is spoken by the Ashkenazim, and most Jews that use Yiddish terms today don't actually speak Yiddish. It's become, your book has this great term for this, a post-vernacular language. The vernacular is the language we speak, right? So the English that we speak is not completely proper English, I think. I don't know where you'd go to find proper English these days. That's our vernacular. Yiddish used to be a vernacular like that. It's not so much used like that anymore. But a lot of words have passed into our language. What are some Yiddish words? Your book brings up yenta. What's a yenta? Anybody know offhand? Somebody's a yenta. busybody, a gossip. Kibitzing is like offering unsolicited advice. If you say somebody's a schmuck, you guys familiar with that term? Person's a schmuck. You know, that's a bad word, right? It's coming from Yiddish. We don't use this one too much anymore, but you know, a shlemiel, sort of a dumb person, unfortunate. These are all things that made their way into American culture. Then your book talks about high culture. And when we talk about high culture, we mean literature, the arts. Film can be high culture, right? A lot of film gets put in that category. And your book gives you a lot of examples, you know, ranging from Elie Wiesel to Saul Bellow, talking about literature. They talk about the involvement in the entertainment industry, music, a number of other things as well. I want to skip over that and talk about two other things that your book mentions in this chapter. One is Kabbalah, and this got kind of popularized. You guys, this is probably a little bit before your time. Do you remember who sort of brought it back on the scene? She got into it. It was a pop star. She's an aging pop star. You know, old enough to be your grandmother. Still out there singing and dancing and doing her thing. Cher? Did you say? No, that's a good guess though. Because Cher might actually be old enough to be your great-grandmother now at this point.
Madonna.
Yeah, Madonna. Madonna got into the Kabbalah. Cher might be into it for all I know, too. And then when Madonna gets into something, a lot of people get into something. And this is a couple years back. What is the Kabbalah? The Kabbalah is this mystical tradition within Judaism, which really gets started in the Middle Ages. And it's taking the traditional Jewish text and some other esoteric texts, and it's about sort of self-discovery, liberating your true self, getting in touch with God. When we talk about mysticism, we mean some sort of unsayable, unexpressible way of getting at reality. And so there's this whole thing. How many of you have ever seen Pi, the movie Pi? It's by the guy who just did Noah.
Life of Pi?
No, not The Life of Pi. That's good to point out the distinction. Life of Pi is about this kid on a raft, right, with a tiger. This is just the movie Pi, about the number pi, which is actually not as boring as it sounds. It's the first film by the guy who just did the Noah movie. I'm blanking on his name. Anybody remember offhand? He's done a lot of other things. Requiem for a Dream, all those. That movie is about the Kabbalah. If you want to know why some of the weird things that are happening in the Noah movie are happening, they're taking from some of their texts. I wish I could remember his name offhand, but I don't want to just throw names out there at random. So that's one thing to think about. Another thing is it talks about politics. Which way does the Jewish vote usually go? It actually kind of breaks down. I wish I hadn't erased this. It's starting to break down along lines of denominations. Orthodox Jews tending to go more Republican, conservative through Reconstructionist Jews being hardcore Democrat. It used to be that the Democrats were the party for the non-Protestant establishment, people. But if you're at all traditional, the Republicans have done a good job. They've done this with Catholics too, of attracting the votes of social conservatives. Your book talks about a number of Jews representing states with large Jewish constituencies have achieved distinction in Congress. Lieberman would be a prime example. Lieberman is a modern Orthodox Jew. He was the Democratic Party candidate for vice president quite a long time ago, back with Al Gore. And then he actually sort of crossed lines a bit as well. does it talk about? Politics. Yeah, here we go. There have been a couple key issues that have been very divisive in the Jewish community. The role of Israel, whether we should be supporting Israel or not. It's not something that Jewish opinion is uniform upon, and it gets debated quite a bit. Jews have played a major role in a lot of different causes. And your book gives you examples ranging across the ideological spectrum, from the Communist Party all the way to neoconservatism. So all the way from left to right. Why have they had such an important role? Well, a lot of that has to do with this sort of thing of having education, having drive, coming from a tradition that stresses the role of being articulate, of ethical obligations, those sorts of things. So that's where we'll close. We are now finished with, for all intents and purposes, with Judaism. And I won't see you. Have a good Easter break. I imagine a lot of you are going home to your families. So safe travels and have a good time.